Welcome to A Guide to Every Deck in EDH. Today we're looking at Greasefang. Yes, indeed, Greasefang has made his way from Pioneer to EDH. So if you're not familiar with Greasefang, this is a 3-mana Orzhov commander. He's a 4/3, and he says at the beginning of combat on your turn, return target vehicle card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste. Return it to its owner's hand at the beginning of your next end step. So obviously, the big thing that Greasefang does in Pioneer is that you find a way to get Parhelion into your graveyard. You then reanimate it. It has crew 4, which means Greasefang can crew it. Then you attack with Parhelion, and it creates 2 4/4 flying vigilance attackers that persist, which in Pioneer means you're dealing 13 damage and leaving behind some pretty big flyers, which is great in 1v1. Not as great in a 4-player commander pod where you need to deal 120 damage. But nevertheless, we are going to select the best vehicles that we can immediately bring back and crew with Greasefang. So same basic strategy, loot these into our graveyard and then get these cards back. So we have, of course, Parhelion as mentioned. We also have Cybership, 6 mana, 8/8 flyer. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, mill 2 cards of that player's library onto the battlefield face down under your control. We've got Cybership. This is an 8/8 flyer with whenever it deals combat damage to a player, put the top 2 cards of their library onto the battlefield face down under your control as 2/2s. So Parhelion-esque, another big flying vehicle that makes creatures. We have Foreboding Steamboat. This is when it enters, each player chooses 2 non-token, non-vehicle creatures they control, exile them until Foreboding Steamboat leaves the battlefield. So basically you pseudo-edict or O-ring 2 creatures on every side of the board. And when it attacks, you can put a card exiled with it into its owner's graveyard to make a clue token. We've got Knight Paladin, which is a 6/6 trampler, and when it enters, it deals 4 to each opponent. Reaver Titan, which is protection from mana value 3 or less. It's a 10/10, and it says whenever it attacks, it deals 5 to each opponent. The Pridewind Steel Flagship, a 6/6 flyer. Whenever another non-token artifact enters under your control, you create a 2/2 human knight with this creature gets +2 as long as an artifact entered the battlefield under your control this turn. Thunderhawk Gunship, 6/6 flyer. When it enters, create 2 2/2s with vigilance, and whenever it attacks, your attackers gain flying. And then finally, Peace Walker Colossus, which is here to be another way of animating our vehicles in case Greasefang isn't around or we just don't have other creatures to crew them. Now, all told, looking at this vehicle selection, there are really not a lot of great options. So just making some big creatures hit our opponents and making some tokens is not going to cut it. We do need to slow our opponents down, and that's why Greasefang is necessarily going to be a stacks beatdown deck. But moving on, we have some blinking and flickering effects in Far Traveler and Teleportation Circle. These are mainly here so that if we want, we can keep the vehicles in play instead of bouncing them to their hand. Remember, Greasefang returns the vehicle to the owner's hand at the beginning of the end step. So if we want the vehicle to persist on the battlefield, we can use these to blink them, and then they'll stick around. We also need ways of looting, so we've got Collector's Vault and Network Terminal as some ways of drawing and discarding cards because we need their vehicles to be in the graveyard. We do have just some straight up card draw, and we also have ways of sacking artifacts. So since Greasefang reanimates the vehicles anyway, we can sack them with Chronomancer or Tarian's Journal, and then we just get them back next turn regardless. Pretty straightforward Orzhov lands with some additional abilities to sack stuff because, again, we want to be able to have the option of sacking our vehicles to reanimate them again next turn. So Phyrexia's Core, Phyrexian Tower, and also Mech Hanger here as a way of animating our vehicles. We've got some protection for Greasefang so it doesn't die or get countered. Got a whole bunch of ramp spells. We need to get Greasefang out as quickly as possible. Some additional removal. And then we've got our stacks cards. So a lot of this is going to be based on getting a big vehicle like up our Parhelion into play and making some tokens and then just blowing up everybody's lands. So we will have the biggest board with our huge vehicles and whatever tokens they generate, and our opponents will not be able to do anything. We will not be able to do anything either, but it doesn't matter because our creatures are bigger than theirs. And then other things like Deafening Silence and anti-ETB triggers with Doorkeeper Thrall, Trinisphere, etc. Then we've also got some tutors, including things like Entomb and Unmarked Grave. These are ways of just going and finding some big vehicles and immediately putting them into the graveyard. And then on top of that, Underworld Cookbook is here because we wanted a way that Urza's Saga could go fetch an artifact that allows us to ditch some of these big vehicles from our hand, and Dark Deal as another way of just wheeling, putting all of the cards from our hand, including our big vehicles, into the graveyard. And while there were other vehicles that do exist in the Orzhov colors, none of them were really that good, so these were the ones that represented the best options. But anyways, with all that being said, that is going to do it for Greasefang in EDH.